Okay, and um, as you can see, I've prepared a right new topic for you, and I've actually been postponing doing this for a couple weeks now because the news has been so urgent, alarming, important that I've felt that what I would like to do with you, frankly, which is to take a break from the narrow focus on the immediacy of this constant onslaught of almost entirely bad news that confronts us as we pay attention to what is happening in American politics and the politics of the world for the last 12 months, right? We are now marking officially the beginning of the second year of Donald Trump's presidency, and it has been exhausting, demoralizing, enraging, and outraging, right? The number of norms that have been shattered, the number of laws that have been broken, the grotesque inhumanity, the recklessness, the incompetence, the damage done in the first year of the Trump administration is hard to measure, hard to fathom, certainly hard to hold in your mind and memory all at once. And this does seem to be part of the modus operandi of this administration, which is if it does enough and it does it with such velocity, if it does, let me say, too much, right? And it does it in such an accelerated way, no one will know what to concentrate on. The forces that might resist will be disorganized. People will frankly lose track of everything that matters. And so while observing all of that, I also, in a sense, wanted to not, right, completely put my head in the sands, completely take a detour into topics that don't matter, but to try to take a step back and gain larger perspective by talking with you about some deeper issues. You know, is the problem with America the deepest economic problem in 2026 that we have an affordability crisis, that we don't have a sufficient supply of goods, that we need to pursue an abundance agenda, or is it a deeper crisis of well-being? Is it the goods that we have are not producing the satisfaction, the well-being that we expect them to produce, and we don't know what else to do other than to pursue more, and therefore we complain that things are not affordable or that the supply is not enough. I'm going to speak with you about that, I promise. But before I do, I'm gonna not do this because what is happening, and I assume that many of us are watching the news. What is happening in Minneapolis this morning is deeply, deeply problematic. And so to begin with, I hope we're all aware. If not, I apologize for having to share the bad news with you. Another American citizen was killed in Minneapolis this morning, a 37-year-old man. Um, I do not have sufficient information on what happened to judge what occurred, right? There is footage. It appears the man was armed. It appears that the law enforcement, the Department of Homeland Security officers tried to disarm him, that a struggle resulted, and that while there were multiple officers holding him, he was shot. It may be that this is a justifiable use of lethal force in the immediate situation. I do not have enough information to have any responsible opinion about that. So I'm not going to say anything about that. What I am going to say is that this is not only something that should absolutely be anticipated, will occur as long as the Gestapo tactics that are being employed by the Department of Homeland Security officers are continuing in this relatively small city of Minneapolis, despite the fact that they clearly no longer have any meaningful legal rationale for being there. But that it is also, in a sense, welcome by this administration, that this is what they want. This is what they're looking for. This is what they have recruited for in terms of, right, the 12,000 new ICE officers who've been brought in, the rapid expansion of Customs and Border Patrol officers, the placing of the Custom and Border Patrol officers who are trained to deal with non-citizens at the border in a situation in which they have very limited rights. They're in a quasi-military context, now being deployed in the in the interior of the country and in leadership positions, right? The firing of a number of the field office managers, the deputy director and the director of ICE, and their replacement by people who come out of Customs and Border Patrol, right, is transforming this agency into the kind of agency that is going to provoke a backlash when it interacts with citizens. And they are trying to provoke it. They are trying to provoke us because they want the pretext. They want the video. They want the image. And what it allows them to say, right, which is that Minneapolis is out of control, lawless, looting, rioting, and needs the Insurrection Act to be invoked, but more importantly, needs a kind of military response because it is an internal insurrection and rebellion, right? This is what they want. And by the way, they are effectively producing it. I'm going to be brief about this, but among the things that have come to light since the last time we spoke is that there's an internal memorandum in the Department of Homeland Security that says that Department of Homeland Security officials, be they ICE or Customs and Border Patrol, can enter the residence of people in the United States, break down their doors, and come into the privacy, the sanctuary of their own home without a warrant, a judicial warrant, or judicial authorization. And I want to be as clear as possible. This is a fundamental violation of constitutional rights. And this is the administration producing a memorandum saying that its law enforcement officers are not constrained by law, by custom, or by the Constitution in their operations, right? This is rooted in the Fourth Amendment, which protects us against unreasonable search and seizure, and in the Fifth Amendment, which puts all of us in the protection of due process of the law. You bring those two things together, right? And when the government believes, whether that's the local government, the state government, or the federal government, that they have sufficient evidence to violate the constitutional protection of the privacy of our own homes, they need to present that evidence to a judge and to be able to convince the judge that this is not just their suspicion, but that it meets the standard for reasonable legal suspicion so that they can actually enter the home. Claiming that they have the power to do this is claiming that the Constitution is inapplicable to them. And I want to be as clear as possible. The Constitution does not grant these rights to citizens. It grants these rights to persons, right? That includes non-citizens, right? And so if ICE, if Department of Homeland Security has the authority to not abide by the Constitution, to not respect the constitutional right of persons, it has the right to do this to citizens. And so this is among, right, the features of the lawlessness of this operation. And what is clear, right, in Minneapolis is that American citizens are not going to put up with essentially a presidential administration organizing a paramilitary force and using it to systematically invade into in order to break the will of an American city. And so let me just continue to fill in a little bit more information. I'm not going to speak about what's happening right now in Minneapolis. It appears that there is something that may spiral out of control very rapidly, right? The Department of Homeland Security officers retreated behind police lines and then came back out charging with, as far as I can tell, flash grenades and tear gas and pepper gas bombs, right? And so they're not willing to de-escalate. But make it absolutely clear they want escalation. They are trying to provoke a violent conflict in Minneapolis. What I want to add, right? These are the people who are being recruited. They're being recruited using, right, the not coded, the obvious language of QAnon, of the Proud Boys, of people who believe in white supremacy and racist conspiracy theory, and they're trying to break the will of a multicultural city or to rain violence down upon it in order to punish it for not embracing their vision of racial hierarchy, their brand of politics. And now let me add, right, that the stunning expansion of these forces that the one big beautiful bill creates $174 billion for immigration enforcement in that bill. And the figure, to put it in context, makes immigration enforcement the third largest military in the world, right? Only the United States and China spends more on its military than the United States has allocated just last year for immigration enforcement. And so I hate to say it, but I think we are in the early stages of seeing the expansion of the capacity for violence that the federal government will rain down on cities where it does not like the way the population of that city has chosen to organize its political life. It wants to be a diverse community. It wants to welcome migrants. It elects officials who create sanctuary city policies. Yes, the government, the federal, right, administration doesn't like those politics. And by the way, we are a large, diverse society, and we are a reasonably free society. And that means we're going to have these kinds of disagreements. We have a federal system, which means that these cities and these states get to pass their own laws, right? And up until this point in American history, we have, for the most part, allowed these kinds of disagreements to not occur violently, right? To not provoke violence from the federal government directed at localities, at cities, municipalities, states, unless those states or municipalities are violating the constitutional rights of the people who live in those societies. That is not the case in Minneapolis. This is not Mississippi in the middle of the 1960s, where we needed the National Guard to be able to desegregate the schools, to be able to stop the lynching in order for African Americans to be able to vote. This is a very different scenario. And so the idea that the federal government is outfitting itself, right? Hiring more and more people who are being selected for their thuggishness, for their lawlessness, for their racism, and for their hostility to their fellow citizens, that they are building the infrastructure of surveillance technology under the auspices of immigration enforcement, but in ways that can be used against our fellow citizens. This demands our attention. This is a very dangerous moment in our politics. And by the way, I think it is not coincidental that this is 11 months, a little bit less than that, before a national election in which, if, right, the polls are accurate and my reading of American public opinion, obviously not mine alone, is accurate, we are on our way to a decisive repudiation of what this administration is doing, right? And so in this moment, this administration is trying to maximize its use of force, its manipulation of the optics of our politics in a way that intimidates, that asserts power, and that allows it to consolidate as much power as possible before the people have a chance to push back, to ultimately, hopefully, correct course. So I just feel compelled to say that to you as we get started this morning, given the limited information I have, but given the obvious, right, likelihood that something like this was going to happen again, as, right, the federal government, the Department of Homeland Security, its paramilitary troops deliberately provoke and escalate a confrontation in an American city. Let me stop for a moment. I'm speaking passionately. This is something I was teaching another class until an hour ago, right? And so this is something I have just learned, just come up to speed with, and perhaps my emotions are getting a little bit the better of me, but I did want to share that with you. I want to hear if you have reactions or if you want me to go where I was intending to go with you, which was actually kind of far away from this stuff. Wilma, I can see you. Go ahead. Got to unmute yourself, right?
Uh, what makes you think that we will have a midterm election?
Um, the people of Minneapolis, the long-standing culture, the political culture, the rhythms of our society. I think canceling elections is a bit like trying to cancel Christmas, right? It's too deeply woven into the fabric and the culture and the rhythms of our society. And by the way, right, Donald Trump is an unpopular president, increasingly unpopular. I haven't looked today, but it's approaching 60% of the population who disapproves of his presidency, right? And I will just note that although people actually like the fact that he's got control over the southern border, and that's a tendentious way to put it. I don't actually mean that, but that the southern border appears to be less porous to immigration than it was under Joe Biden, is popular. They dislike the interior immigration enforcement politics, and they need to have the opportunity to express that politically. So I don't think the question is, will we have elections? I think the question is, will they be fairly conducted? Will they be fairly tabulated? Will the results of casting the vote determine the outcome in the elections? And here I am not as sanguine. I do think that this administration, right, this president has already shown if he anticipates that he's going to lose an election, he will do everything in his power to change the results of that election. I don't think it is in his power to prevent the election from occurring. But having said that, I think, right, alleging fraud, rejecting the results, trying to produce violence to intimidate people from exercising their rights or having the exercise of their right influence the distribution of political power. I don't put any of that past him. And I do think this is the moment for clear-eyed realism and vigilance about this. I just think the elections are going to happen, and that it would be too illegitimate, too authoritarian, too tyrannical, too violent to prevent them from happening. That's not a 100% reassurance, right? But at least it says we're going to have an avenue, right? And the right more vigilant, the more active, the more mobilized and organized we are between now and the first Tuesday in November, the more likely it is that those elections are actually going to accurately represent the opinion and will of the American people, which is obviously imperative at this moment. Yeah, thank you, Wilma. And I know, right, when you see what's happening in Minneapolis, you wonder, right, who are they coming for next? And I'll just say this very quickly. When they get $170+ billion, they're going to be coming for more and more of America, right? Unless and until we can claw that money back, we can, right, bring this law enforcement agency, and it pains me to even call it that. We can bring ICE and CBP to heel because they are out of control. They are lawless, they are repressive, and they are killing American citizens. They are doing what authoritarian regimes asked their paramilitary troops to do. This is un-American.
Trump's private army.
Yeah, so call them that if you will, but it's not Trump alone, right? He wouldn't have this vast expansion if it weren't for the fact that Republicans in Congress appropriated, right, approaching $175 billion for this, more money than any other military in the world except for China and us get. Right. And by the way, this wouldn't be happening if the Supreme Court of the United States had the mettle to recognize lawlessness where it's occurring and to stop it, or to allow the circuit courts to stop it. Right. So, and of course, it wouldn't be happening without the support of, let's call it, 40% of America. Right. And so, yes, it is Trump's army, but it's more complex in terms of the preconditions for it to actually be able to become something like an occupying force in an American city in 2026. Yeah. Thank you, Wilma. Anything else? No. Okay. Anybody else? This is going to feel like a 180-degree turn. But I have been trying to do this with you for several weeks now. And in a sense, I feel like we do Donald Trump and his administration a favor if we are just always reactive, never setting our own agenda for ourselves, always paying attention to and focused on whatever they do to provoke us, right? And so with that justification or setup, let me now talk with you about what I've been wanting to talk with you about. Shoot, I think I just did the wrong thing. Let's see if I can undo it. Give me a second. You're not seeing my slides, right?
No, we are now.
You are, so you see abundance, affordability, and
Yes.
well-being. Yeah, okay, it actually did work. So I want to notice, and again, this is in the background, I think, of what's happening in the United States. Why do 40% of Americans support a government using lawless, repressive violence against their fellow citizens? And I think it's because they have become convinced that their fellow citizens have abandoned them, don't care about them, are so different from them that they are no longer really part of the same community, and that the right reaction to them is to try to make them suffer because they have made us suffer, right? I'm putting words in the mouth of the people who elect, right, the Republican speakers in the Minnesota state legislature who are not so critical of what is happening in their own state, of the people in Wisconsin and Ohio and Kentucky who feel that their urban fellow residents have become this weird liberal elite that cares about immigrants and African Americans, affirmative actions, LGBTQ people, gay marriage, trans, sports, but not about them, right? And so this sense that, right, a large portion of the country feels left out of prosperity, feels betrayed, feels that their expectations, the promise of upward economic mobility is completely abandoned in the United States in the 21st century for people like them. I want to drill down on this. And I want to drill down on it in the context of 2026. And this is a context in which these people, right, and I want to be careful. These are our fellow citizens, and these are people who have good reason to feel aggrieved. They really have been left out of a lot of the wealth creation in this country for the last 50 years. They really have seen their material prospects decline at a moment when the wealth generated by the country has been increasing in a way that makes us the envy of the world. Macroeconomically, we have a great economy, but it's left a very large portion of the American people out of the abundance it's created. So there's a fertile ground for populist, nativist, authoritarian, extremist politics, for polarization, for us versus them, friend enemy ways of organizing political contests. And we are paying the price in 2025, 2026, and unfortunately, probably for the next 3 years. And so we need to try to understand this as well as we can, to try to understand the source of the anger, the resentment, the grievance, the desire for retribution and vengeance against your fellow citizen, the hatred, the scapegoating. These are bad, ugly, nasty politics. And by the way, we are still saddled with an 18th century constitution that is appearing increasingly incapable of restraining the destructive forces these kinds of politics unleash from playing out, right? So let us hope we still have time to figure out what's gone wrong and then to begin to address it. Let us assume the Democrats actually win power in 2026 and 2028 because the bad politics of Make America Great Again will have exhausted themselves, will have been revealed to have been based on lies and false promises, to not work, and to collapse under the weight of the incompetence of the people administering the politics, as well as the emptiness of the promises they have made, because our problems cannot be traced back to globalization and immigration, right? You know that there may be some truth to the idea that globalization has created certain difficulties for certain people in this country, But please note, it has also created tremendous access to affordable goods for large numbers of people. It's too complicated to put it in a simple, right, us versus them, good versus bad frame, but that's what MAGA and Trump do. That will be exhausted. I can only imagine that that will ring hollow by the time we get to 2028, if it isn't already. So, what do we offer, and how do we present a more convincing alternative, a more humane, a more democratic kind of politics, and a more inclusive, fair, just, but also an economy, right? Inclusive, fair, just is the economy, an economy that actually promotes human well being. And I want to be as clear as possible. I am not sure that just more goods at lower prices solves our well-being problem. And so that's where I want to go with you. And so I hope, right, it is clear that this is an issue that has economic dimensions to it. Is the economy fairly distributing the wealth it's creating? Is it fairly distributing the access to the goods that it is producing? But it also has a political dimension to it, right? And that is, if not, how can we regulate our economy, or what kinds of policies should we implement to promote an economy that is better at promoting human well-being? And then it has a philosophical dimension to it. By the way, what exactly is human well being? Is it something that there's one clear, objective answer to that question? Or is it something in which there are multiple ways of thinking about well being? But even if there are, right, various ways of pursuing a good life in 21st century America, what kind of support do we need from our economy and from our government, from its policies, in order to be equipped to pursue those diverse ways of flourishing? And so that seems to me to be as much a philosophical, humanistic, and existential question as it is an economic or a political question. And I want to survey this issue with all of those tools, and to spend the time to do it with the complexity and the curiosity that it requires. And I do hope, on the one hand, that it will provide us with some resources with which to think more deeply about our political moment. But at the same time, the fact that it has these economic and philosophical dimensions to it may also provide a little bit of relief from just thinking about the abysmal spectacle that American politics, right, presents us with relentlessly over the last year. So I have on the board two pieces of art, one of which I know you've seen from me before, and I reuse it because I think it's such a good study of the psychology of inequality and the kinds of deformation that the deference it requires produces, right? And so that is, of course, Goya's Gift for the Master. I've spoken with you about it before. I won't do it again today, but I will speak for a moment about Jan Bruegel the Elder and Hendrik von Baelen's Abundance and the Four Elements, right? And this is a piece of art that I found to think about the theme of abundance. And it is from the early 17th century, 1615. It is, right, by Flemish masters, and it is worthwhile noting, right? In case it's not clear enough, right? The people dancing in the air, right? The putti dancing about in a garden of abundance. This is an Olympian scene. This is a scene in which gods are showering abundance upon a god. And in 1615, when this was painted, abundance was not something that human beings really encountered, right? And even the richest, right, the kings and queens of the great empires of Europe did not have the kind of plenty, frankly, that very often we take for granted when we go into the grocery store, right? They did not have fresh fruit and vegetables from all over the world in the heart of winter, for instance, right? And so the idea that if you were talking about abundance, you were talking about something supernatural, um, I think is worth noting. And as I said to you as we began to talk about this recently, right, I'm inspired by Ezra Klein and Derek Thompson's work on abundance, right? The book that was published a little bit less than a year ago, and that I think some of you may actually be reading, um, to to think about the relationship between affordability and abundance, because their claim is that in the middle of the 20th century, abundance stopped being an Olympian fantasy and actually became a human reality in the United States of America, and that it became a reality for us because our government promoted it. And I think the clearest example here is the supply of housing for middle class and working class white Americans. And again, it's worthwhile noting that at the beginning of the 20th century, owning a home was something that was reserved really for the very wealthy, the very wealthiest of us. Um, and that this was in part about the way in which homes were constructed. Freestanding homes were either, right, places in the boondocks. If you owned a little farm, sure, you could purchase the land. Maybe even the government gave it to you, and then you built a little home on it, and then you had your homestead. But if you wanted to be in urban America, and more of our country at the beginning of the 20th century was moving to the cities, we'll talk about this in a moment. Well, you rented an apartment, right? And typically it was not a big space or a nice space, right? Very often it was poorly lit and poorly heated, and you were jam-packed in there, and it was frankly kind of squalid conditions. We call these building now tenements, right? And it was the average way, the typical way that people who crowded into America's cities lived at the beginning of the 20th century. And that's in part because owning a home in a city was for the very wealthy. And that in particular in the aftermath of the Great Depression and World War II, with the VA bill, with the right creation of federal mortgage insurance, with the regulation of mortgages, but also with suburbanization and with the government subsidization through low or zero interest loans to real estate developers, through the creation of the infrastructure, the transportation system, the electrical network, the sewers and water supplies required for the suburbs to take off quickly. Um, it was the case that the United States government aided, assisted, and subsidized the creation of a totally different approach to housing in which most middle class and many working class people bought their own homes. And one of the key ideas here is the 30-year fixed payment mortgage, right? Fixed interest rate, fixed payment, and the idea that this basically didn't exist at the beginning of the 20th century anywhere in the world, and it has become an absolute fixture of American middle class property acquisition in the 20th and 21st centuries, but it is also the creation of American public policy. It actually doesn't make economic sense for banks to issue these kinds of loans, but the government has required or aided in the general availability, and then, of course, created a tax code that favors these kinds of investments, right? Because if you have this kind of mortgage, your interest is tax deductible, right? And by the way, note what a boon, what an incredible advantage it is to be able to pay the same amount 29 years later that you were paying 29 years before, and in the process to gain equity in an asset that is almost certainly appreciating in value, perhaps dramatically. It is a real win for the middle class, for the working class, that our government assisted in the creation of housing and in the creation of the financial instrument that made it accessible to so many of us. And by the way, it's not just the ownership of the home, it's the physical mobility that assisted in economic mobility. And so one of the things you learn when you read Klein and Thompson's book is that we moved a lot more in the 20th century than we're moving in the 21st century. We moved to where the jobs were. Very often that meant moving to the city. Right, and so I'll stop there. I want to get into some of the data, but the idea that abundance is something that government can create, not just a fantasy of another realm in the modern world, and that the fact that the government has stopped pursuing policies that generate abundance is what is creating the affordability crisis, that the affordability crisis is creating the crisis of well-being in the United States in the 21st century, and that is what is feeding our dangerous, destructive, angry politics. This is the bundle of ideas that I want to consider from a critical vantage to make sure we get this right in case we are positioned in the years to come to be able to actually govern again and enact good policy. Is this the right diagnosis? Because the prognosis depends on getting the diagnosis right and treating it correctly. Is this the right way to understand the fundamental problem with the American political economy in the 21st century? And just to set this up briefly, this will be familiar, right? The idea that Donald Trump, but I want to be careful here. I don't think it's just Donald Trump. I think it is the brand of right-wing populist economic policy that he represents, right, has lost support. This is now, right, quite old from November of last year. I suspect in the intervening couple months, this has gotten worse, right, as his poll numbers have come down. But he had already lost 1 in 6 of the people who voted for him in early November of 2025. And largely he had lost them because he had made promises about the economy, because he was divisive, because his immigration and tariffs policies were contributing to inflation, not delivering on his economic promises. So let us hope, right, that we are learning the hard way, that economic populism of the kind that Donald Trump offers, that the nativistic, anti-globalization species of politics that he offers, is not in the simple and crude way in which he peddles it going to solve our problems. That opens the door, right, for alternative forms of maybe left-wing economic populism, or certainly, let us hope, better policies. But what kind of policies should we embrace? And here I just want to note very quickly, right, this peculiar diagram, right? And maybe not so peculiar, maybe philosophically this makes sense, but I think from an economist point of view, the idea that disposable income keeps going up and up and up, and consumer confidence keeps going down and down and down and is driven to near record lows while disposable income is going up looks odd. And so let me put not too fine a point on it: increased income, increased prosperity, increased abundance, judged at the level of the largest image, macroeconomic, right, data that doesn't take into account, are you in the bottom 50%, are you in the top 10%, just averages that all together, does not behave the way that we think it should in the 21st century. Greater prosperity is not generating greater economic confidence, satisfaction, or well-being. Then please note, yes, there is a partisan divide still. When Biden is president, Democrats think the economy is doing better than Republicans. When Trump is president, Republicans think the economy is doing better. But please note that that gap is not as big as it used to be. And in particular, Republicans are not as happy with the economy, and Democrats are even more unhappy. Again, it seems to me we may emerge from this administration, right, thinking these kinds of policies are not going to cut it anymore. Right. So the idea that unemployment is quite high, especially if we use the broad unemployment categories, that unemployment is uneven, but that there are many sectors of the economy that are not doing well, that the people in the bottom earning groups are not seeing their wages increase as much as they were in the recent past. But in other words, there was real signs of economic stress lurking not too far beneath the big picture economic data. And by the way, so much of what Trump has promised has not come to fruition, right? And so we're not getting new jobs in the private sector other than in eds and meds for the most part in the first year of Donald Trump's presidency. We're seeing declines in construction, manufacturing, mining, and logging. And I pay attention to those, or the people who assemble this data pay attention to those, right, categories of jobs because they're seen as masculine jobs, whereas the eds and med jobs are seen as feminine jobs. Maybe that's part of the problem. Maybe we should be a little bit less rigid in the gender categorization of our jobs. And if men went into eds and meds more, they would be a little bit less angry about how the economy is treating them. But that is one of the places that we are not right currently addressing via policy. And the result is that we have not seen a big gain in jobs for men. We have not seen a big decrease in unemployment for the native born. Trump's policies are not having the effects that they were right marketed, that he campaigned on, that he promised. And so, as opposed to that, we're continuing to see an economy with tremendous inequality, right? Where new jobs are not being reliably created, where in particular Black Americans and young Americans are suffering very high levels of unemployment. One of the reasons Trump won in 2024 is enough Black people, and especially young people, threw support to him because they thought maybe he would be better for the economy. We're seeing a K-shaped economy, an up or out economy. Stock market's doing great. Consumer confidence is not. If you get a lot of your income and wealth from stocks, you think the economy is doing well. If not, you think the economy is doing abysmally. If you're in the top 10%, you're spending, right? And you know, propping up the American economy. If you're in the bottom 90%, You're not spending nearly so much. And the result is that our economy is increasingly catering the goods that it produces to the most affluent. We have a luxury goods consumption economy. So, the idea that this is beginning to um, influence the judgment of the public on Donald Trump and his economic policies, right? Are you better or worse off in 2026 than you were in 2024, right? Um, Most people say worse, worse off, right? And a huge margin among Democrats, but a substantial margin among independents. And although there is this partisan split, please note, right, the 1 in 6 Americans who voted for Trump who are turning against him, some of them are likely to be Republicans as well. The idea that when it comes to, right, Trump's approval in the most recent New York Times Siena poll, which was just concluded, right, very high disapproval rating. And by the way, this mainly matches the Nate Silver polling average. So it's not just one poll. The one place that Trump is above water is on the border, right? But when it comes to managing the federal government, Venezuela, immigration, the economy, he is way underwater. And the result is that it looks like the Democrats have a significant advantage going into 2026, hopefully 2028 as well. And I say that again to set up the question that I want to discuss with you. What should the Democrats focus on in 2026 and 2028 if they want to actually be able to address the underlying problem? And so let me say very quickly, I think talking about affordability and abundance appears to be a political winner in 2026. It certainly was in 2025. We've talked together about the shift in the vote in Virginia, in New Jersey, what happened in New York City, the idea that candidates who were disciplined in their focus on affordability did very well, right? But we've got to ask ourselves. I think this is so obvious, but it needs unpacking. What does affordability mean? Does it literally mean the price of eggs is too high? The price of gas is too high? The price of housing and childcare and healthcare are too high? And here I want to just begin, right, by comparing two things, right? This is the consumer price index from 1775, the beginning of our country, to 2024. And I want you to notice, right, that for the first almost 200 years of American history, up until the early 1970s, there was either almost no or very modest inflation, right? And then beginning in the 1970s, when we came off of the gold standard, when we began to experience rapid increases in petroleum prices, and that began to drive inflation up. We entered a period of much more rapid increases in prices. But I want you to notice, right, that it doesn't appear, right, this is the 2008 Great Recession, that inflation has been that much higher. Yes, it did spike in the aftermath of some of the COVID stimulus policies and some of the supply chain problems caused by COVID, but not really a sustained bout of rapid inflation relative to what inflation has been. So is the problem that, beginning roughly in 1970, we've just been having sustained faster inflation, or is the problem something else? And then I point you immediately to this diagram, which I know is very familiar, which shows us, well, one of the things that happens simultaneously is we've gone from being a country with a very equal or compressed distribution of household income. The top 5%, the top 20% are not that far apart from the bottom 80% in 1965. And in 2025, boy, are they far apart, right? And so is it that, right, goods are increasing in price, or goods that are increasing in price more rapidly than incomes are increasing, and the result is that they escape the purchasing power of people? Is the fundamental problem affordability, inflation, or inequality? That's the kind of question that I think we need to figure out the answer to before we, right, dig our heels in and say we know what kind of policy we need. And so I'll focus for just a moment on housing and point out, right, that when we start looking at housing, not just in terms of the increase in the cost of housing, but more importantly, as a ratio for I'm sorry, in relationship to what the wage, the prevailing minimum wage, right, or the prevailing wage in the country is. We can see, right, housing has increased very rapidly relative to minimum wages. We can see that housing has become much more expensive relative to average income, right? And so where it used to be we had to save for 2.5 years to buy a home, now we have to save for 7 years. That is to say, to save 7 years of our typical family income to afford a home. And then, right, home value versus income change. Home value has been going up much more rapidly than income has been going up. And again, that keeps people from acquiring this incredibly important resource in the United States for obtaining middle class, both economic security and status. And it also keeps people very often from moving to where the good jobs are, right? And so the number of people in the United States spending more than a third of their income on their housing has gone up dramatically. The number of people who are commuting more than 4 hours a day, let that sink in for a second, has gone up dramatically, because if they're going to buy a home, they have to be way far away from where the center of economic activity is. If they're going to live closer, they're not going to be able to buy a home, and then they're probably paying too much in rent, right? And so putting that all together for a second, I want to be clear. I am going to suggest to you that affordability is probably far too simple a term to use to capture what's actually going on in the United States in the 21st century. But that does not mean that affordability is a hoax or that affordability is fundamentally confused. We are having trouble affording essential goods, and the fact that essential goods are increasing rapidly in price is creating a sense that prosperity is receding or escaping us. But I want to also suggest that the question of whether that is the fundamental or the best description of the well-being crisis in the United States is far from clear. If we were happier with our lives, looking at this data, would this create the same level of anxiety, anger, the same kind of destructive politics that it is creating for us? That's right. I hope not just a leading question, an obvious answer. If we were not so dissatisfied, then we might be able to navigate this a little bit more calmly, with a little bit less anxiety, with a little bit less searching for somebody to blame, right? And so, yes, right, and I think this is extremely important. People are shut out of housing. into the rental market, their cost of living is increasing dramatically relative to people who actually own their homes, or the underlying cost of living if you're not thrown into the rental market. Housing in general, along with essential goods, increasing much more rapidly than other categories of expenditure. But please note, and I will finish here with kind of a teaser for what we can continue talking about, I hope next week, and I'll just point you to the central right diagram. And this is again looking only at averages that leave out a lot of the details that matter. But if we look at the overall cost of all items that a typical family consumes in the United States, and right, economists assemble baskets of goods and trace the inflation in their cost over time, the fact is that wages are increasing more quickly than the overall cost of living in the United States. That is probably not an affordability crisis. Certain things are escaping our capacity to purchase, but that doesn't mean that overall most Americans feel that they can no longer afford the life that they got used to or that they are accustomed to. It's more complicated than that. And I don't think, looking at that data, that affordability alone accounts for the level of malaise, dissatisfaction, the lack of well being, the unhappiness in our society. I think we need to dig deeper to account for that. That's where I want to go with you. And it will be, I hope, interesting probing, because please note that these are not issues that philosophers have the answers to, right? They think more maybe carefully and in a sustained way about what constitutes well-being, but the result is that they end up disagreeing with each other. That'll be an interesting controversy for us to investigate together. But for today, let me pause, stop, and ask, what questions, thoughts, concerns do you have? John, go ahead, please.
David, I'm sorry I'm interrupting your talk completely, but I wanted to warn people uh, when you get off of this broadcast and then look at the news, a man was shot and killed in Minneapolis about half an hour ago. There's a video of it that I don't think you want to watch. I'm kind of sorry I watched it. I can't get it out of my head. So
John,
watch it. Watch it. It's going to be published. It's going to be every place, and you can watch it in great detail. But I mean, it's quite vivid. But I would suggest stopping and thinking before you look at it.
thank you, John. And we did actually spend almost the first half an hour of class talking about, I think, the incident that you're talking about. I think your timing, unless there's been a second person shot.
No. I'm sorry. It must be. I must have my timing off. Okay.
Yeah, it was
I'm
around.
sorry. I didn't hear that part. Yeah.
Yeah,
Okay.
it's okay. Well, around 9 a.m. this morning, I think, is when this actually occurred. And maybe there is, alas, more video now than there was before.
Yeah,
The
that's
video I saw was not as clear as what you're describing.
right.
Anna's shaking her head and saying
Yeah.
yes. Yeah. And I can see somebody else with your hand up. Go ahead. I'm sorry, your name is not displayed, just a number. So tell me who you are and then what do you want to say?
Sally Hendrickson,
Hi,
1409.
Sally. Thank you. Yep.
Good morning. David, all I want to say is thank you so much. It was a brilliant lecture for me. I mean, thank you. Absolutely.
Thank you, Sally. And I recognize, we're all hungry not to be thinking about only Minneapolis right now or only Greenland right now, right?
No, but
Yeah.
it's even wider than that. I mean, I think it's just right on. Having spent years in the housing industry, it particularly resonates, and just thank you.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you, Sally. I appreciate it. And yeah, I do my best to try to formulate things that I think are important and significant and that we're going to learn from talking about together. Appreciate getting the feedback. Uh, David, you've just unmuted yourself. Are you? Yes, go ahead. You got your hand
Yeah,
up.
I just wanted to mention that just yesterday, our state representative, Buffy Wicks, announced that her highest priority this legislative term in California is going to be on issues of affordable housing, and that she's really making a push on that, and also that it interacts with issues of like solar and other alternative forms of power because those are more affordable for people, particularly now that they have do-it-yourself solar options that are beginning to make an inroad around the country, especially in the mountain region and in the Northeast.
Yeah, thank you, David. And I'll just point out very quickly, one of the things you learn from doing this research is that electricity prices have more than doubled in the last decade, right? That's one of the places where we are feeling the pinch in terms of affordability. And by the way, right, solar has become so cheap and so efficient that were it not for the fact that the federal government right now has kind of declared war on solar, it would be a really important way to begin to address this problem. And please note the problem is complex. We're building all of these data centers because they're necessary to AI and crypto and the cloud and all of the computing we've come to integrate into so many aspects of our lives. And the result is that the demand exceeds the supply. That drives things up. And so the abundance agenda, right, as a solution to the affordability crisis, build more solar, right? And then prices will come back down, or if you have it on your home, you won't be paying those prices anymore, right? Let the industries that are hoarding the electricity that are so, right, greedy for it that they're guzzling it, pay the high prices, while we mainly are exempted from that. I have solar, and I have an electric car, and 3/4 of the year I don't pay utilities. This time of the year I do, but that's okay. So
Just
yeah,
one other thing there, and that is that. Oh, never mind. I forgot what I was going to say, but
well,
it was just along the lines that. Oh, I know what it was. The red states, even though they are in there with Trump on promoting fossil fuels, they're hedging their bets because they're also doing a lot with solar and other alternative energies and a lot with AI centers.
yeah, and you mentioned Buffy Wicks, and I was just going to say very quickly that it's not just Buffy Wicks, right? That actually Gavin Newsom and then the state legislature are working on what they call an abundance agenda. And please note, right, that they're directly pointing to Ezra Klein and Derek Thompson and saying we need to get some of the impediments to building affordable housing in, for instance, environmental impact statements and local governance regulations out of the way, because this has made it too hard
Yeah.
to actually build multi-unit residential buildings. And so at least for those kinds of buildings that promise to create affordable housing, let's get the regulatory impediments to building out of the way.
Well, but one of the things that this points out is, do all of these problems have to be dealt with only at the federal level? Can we deal with many of them at local and state levels? And in spite of the horrible broad context in which we're trying to do the right thing.
Yeah, and please note, right, part of the point of having a sanctuary city is precisely to keep the federal government from doing immigration enforcement, or at least to keep your, right, local taxes from paying for your local officials to abet the federal government in doing this kind of stuff. And I do think, again, it's worthwhile remembering, and the parallel with the civil rights movement, I think, is extremely important, that part of the reason that we've got this problem is because the underlying laws are so unjust. The federal immigration laws, right? Such that you can have, as the people in Minneapolis have, people living in their midst for a decade, or 2 decades or 3 decades, contributing to their community, providing essential services, fully integrated, attending the same churches, their children attending the same schools, and there is no pathway to citizenship for them. And so they are permanently vulnerable to summary deportation, right? And that is no way to constitute a community. That is creating a kind of legal vulnerability which is not identical, but certainly has some of the same dimensions that the Jim Crow South visited upon African Americans. I saw, Sally, you had your hand up again, right?
Well,
Go ahead. Yeah.
I think what was exciting for me to be reminded of, I think you said that it's important in the months ahead before pre-election to not get stuck on the word of affordability, but to go deeper as to the meaning behind um, what affordability and what the ability to buy a house and build wealth and meant to American citizens. Is that not true?
It's absolutely true, and that's where I want to go. And so I'll start with the idea of basic, not only economic but social security, right? And
Okay.
and so the idea, and let me just put it in really simple language for today, that if you could buy a home in the United States in the 1950s, 1960s, 1970s, you'd made it, right?
Yeah.
You got on that crucial property ladder economically, that matters, but
Right.
also in terms of your standing, your psychology, right?
Right.
I am now part of the middle class, and I don't have to worry about people looking down at me. It doesn't matter that it's a modest starter home in the burbs, right? I've got a place to call my own. And the idea that in the 21st century, between, and I'm going to throw in now another factor, social media, and the way in which it makes comparisons so easy and frankly so invidious, right? So many people producing their comparisons. I'll do a funny exercise here, right? You look in the background of my feed right now, and you see that I hope a quite attractive display, right? If I turn it up and show you my floor, oh my God, what a mess, right? And I can do that. I can manipulate the image so you only see what I want you to see about my right physical setting right now, and it looks quite nice. And then, right, you turn the corner, and that's the reality. We are comparing ourselves much more invidiously than we used to. And frankly, buying that starter home might not be enough anymore. Are we not in a world where um, consumption, buying, purchasing, even an essential good like a home, no longer delivers the well-being that it did 50 years ago? And so, do we really need to think not just about affordability, but what's lurking under the surface of the anxiety, the insecurity that so many Americans seem to be reporting that they're feeling economically? So, yes, Sally, thank you for returning me to that. And I hope I'm not having my cake and eating it too when I say there is some truth to the affordability crisis, but I think it's a very simple shorthand
Right.
for what is a
Yes.
much more complex
Right.
problem. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Do you think there are people bending their minds to that?
Say it again. Do I think?
Are you optimistic about any group of people bending their minds to that challenge?
Okay. So, no. And I gotta be careful here. There's earlier scholarship that I like a lot by, for instance, Juliet Shore, that documents some places. Berkeley is one of them. Ithaca, New York, I think is an even clearer example where people have tried to create alternative economies that are less sensitive to, and here I'll get just a little bit technical for a second, comparative goods, right? And so if I start viewing my home not simply as the place where I'm going to make my life, where I'm going to raise my family, where I'm going to put my books or my art or, my memorabilia, but I got to look across the street and compare the square footage in my home with the square footage in my neighbor's home. And I'm not happy unless I have as much or more square footage than they have. I'm no longer just building my little oasis. I'm vulnerable because they can always put an addition in. And oh no, I thought I was doing well, but now I'm not because they're doing better, right? That's a comparative good, a good that the value of which is measured in comparison with what other people have. It's often also called a status good or a status marker. And I'm afraid that too many of us now look at our homes and our other essential goods in terms of what they reveal about our relative standing, and we want them to reveal us to be superior, right? And so, what people in Ithaca, in Berkeley, and a few other places in the United States have started to do is to try to create alternative economies, economies that focus on building community, on securing stable, non-comparative, maybe even cooperative goods. But they're a very small portion. They're these weird, isolated pocket communities. Frankly, very often they tend to be rather white. They tend to be rather affluent, right? They tend to be, quote, post-material. And by the way, it's a lot easier to be post-material if you're not terribly worried about meeting your material needs, right? And so I do think one way to put this is what kind of social infrastructure can our society create to allow people to feel confident in what they have without having to compare themselves with others, without having to, be constantly keeping up with the Joneses, as we say, right? And that is the trickier challenge. But that's the kind of issue that I'm interested in framing these questions. And by the way, I'm not done, right? I'm getting started, and I'm pretty much done for today because we've gone on for a long time, and because I do want to come up to speed. I'm not going to follow John's advice. I probably am going to watch this video and then regret it, but I've got to figure out what's going on in the rest of the country right now. But I do want to return to these themes with you, and I do hope that they will allow us to think more clearly and more deeply about some of the challenges facing our country right now. And as always, I'm grateful for the opportunity to be able to discuss this stuff with you. If there's nobody else who has anything urgent to ask after or observe today, going to wish you all a good remainder of the weekend. You should, well, Sandy and Mike, where are you guys? Are you still in Philly?
Yeah, Philadelphia in the storm.
Brace
Yeah.
yourself as I am. I hope you've stocked up. The rest of you, be happy that you're not on the East Coast today, tomorrow, and the day after. And by the way, I'll join you in California. Please save some nice weather for me for next weekend. So be well, everybody. And
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, David.
Wonderful lecture.
Thank you, David.
Thank you. Thank you, guys. Take care. Bye-bye. See you soon.